China's military claims it's starting the largest ever drills around the island.
To send a message that when China is ready, Taiwan will become a part of the mainland.
China's sovereignty cannot be infringed. Chinese people cannot be humiliated.
Taiwan is a member, a state, on the equal footing as other democracies.
The conflict over Taiwan is based on a mix of current events and history. Generally speaking, the Taiwanese are more interested in current events, and the Chinese are more interested in history. For either perspective, knowing at least some history is vital to understanding the conflict. This video is going to take turns telling both sides of the story, and we're going to begin with Taiwan. Taiwan is an island around 240 miles long and 98 miles wide. Despite its small size, it's highly populated with around 24 million people. Taiwan also holds a strategic position off the coast of Southeast Asia, with only 100 miles of water separating it from mainland China. Taiwan's native population, typically called Aborigines, dominated the island in tribal societies for thousands of years. Once overseas trade developed in the 1600s and the strategic location of Taiwan was discovered, a power struggle ensued over the island. That power struggle began in the early 1600s and is still to some extent going on today. Here's a short version of what happened. The Dutch and the Spanish established the first colonies in the 1620s. The Dutch then kicked out the Spanish. Meanwhile, on mainland China, the Ming dynasty was collapsing. In an act of desperation, they made a pirate warlord into a Ming official. The warlord's army tried to defeat the Qing dynasty. They lost and retreated to Taiwan. They kicked out the Dutch and established themselves as the governing authority on the island. Within a couple generations, the warlord's family ceded power to the Qing dynasty, and the Qing declared themselves the new governing authority. The Qing ruled until 1895, when Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War. Upon losing, China gave Taiwan to Japan in the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Imperial Japan then governed Taiwan for 50 years until they lost World War II. Towards the end of the war, the leaders of the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Republic of China met and issued a declaration of their intentions with Japan at the war's end, called the Cairo Declaration. One sentence referred to Taiwan, which at the time was commonly called Formosa. It read, "Japan shall be stripped of all the islands in the Pacific, which she has seized or occupied since the beginning of the First World War, and all the territories Japan has stolen from the Chinese, such as Manchuria, Formosa, and the Pescadores, shall be restored to the Republic of China." To understand this part, you have to understand what the Republic of China is. The Republic of China was the name of China in the early to mid-1900s, when it was divided and mostly governed by a nationalist political party called the Kuomintang. During World War II, the leader of the Kuomintang was Chiang Kai-shek. Using the Cairo Declaration from 1943 and the Potsdam Declaration that basically reiterated it in 1945, Chiang Kai-shek in 1945 declared Taiwan part of the Republic of China, making the Republic of China the new governing authority on Taiwan. That name, the Republic of China, is still the official name for Taiwan today. Around the same time, there was a civil war starting back up in China between the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang. By 1949, the Communists won the civil war. Mao Zedong declared the new name of China the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang fled to Taiwan. That led to a decades-long standoff between the two parties, the People's Republic of China on the mainland and the Republic of China on Taiwan. Both plotted to conquer each other's territories and establish themselves as the governing authority on both mainland China and Taiwan. When mainland China modernized in the 80s, the plot to recapture it was finally abandoned by the Kuomintang. They loosened their single-party rule and allowed Taiwan to democratize. We'll get back to that democratization in a bit. I think this is a good time to reflect on the history that I just described. For all of that time, the people living on Taiwan did not experience consensual relationships between governors and governed. For hundreds of years, the people living on Taiwan experienced a rotating cast of outside authorities that wanted Taiwan and had the power to impose their will on the place. So for all that history, the people living on Taiwan could be meaningfully understood as powerless players in a larger geopolitical game. With that, as you might expect, came a history of resistance in Taiwan, specifically resistance against unwanted authority. The Aborigines fought off all incursions of power into eastern Taiwan for a surprisingly long time. They fought off the early colonists, the Ming, the Qing, and even the Japanese throughout most of their rule. Even as late as the 1930s, eastern Taiwan was a place that most people simply couldn't go. When the Japanese tried to venture into the east in the 30s and establish control of the whole island, they suffered unbearable casualties and even assassinations in response. Things were especially turbulent when the Qing ruled Taiwan. The Qing annexed Taiwan in 1684 and made it part of Fujian province. But they ultimately didn't see much value in Taiwan. They sent low-quality officials there who practiced institutionalized corruption, which led to a notoriously turbulent 200 years, marked by almost 40 anti-Qing uprisings. Things only calmed down once the Japanese took control of Taiwan, who ran it as a police state, although it was a police state that somewhat modernized the place. The Republic of China claiming Taiwan in 1945 didn't change that historical pattern. Cultural and historical ties to mainland China led the Taiwanese to be initially hopeful that Chinese governance would be a political improvement. So the Taiwanese initially warmly welcomed their mainland brethren, but disillusionment quickly set in as they began to realize that new foreign rulers had merely replaced old ones. The new governor refused to speak Taiwanese. Tens of thousands of Taiwanese officials lost their jobs, and the new administration refused to appoint any qualified Taiwanese to top-level positions. Combined with mounting economic problems, the Taiwanese quickly turned against the Kuomintang. Widespread protests broke out in February of 1947. The government effectively lost control of Taiwan. The army was called in. Widespread and indiscriminate killing followed, which has since been called the 228 incident or the 228 massacre. It's disputed how many were killed in the 228 incident, but what's not in dispute is that it led to a mental shift on Taiwan. It ended the sort of precarious honeymoon between the Taiwanese and the mainland Chinese, and led to the beginning of modern independence movements in Taiwan. The Kuomintang went on to grow the economy and modernize Taiwan, but still for a long time, Taiwanese didn't experience political freedom. For about the next 40 years, Taiwan was governed by martial law, which included restrictions on speech and a tightly controlled media. The Kaohsiung incident in 1979 also furthered antagonisms between the public and the Kuomintang, when the government cracked down on human rights activists working on the popular Formosa magazine. The thing that finally broke the cycle and gave people in Taiwan a sense of control over their political lives was their democratization. Democracy was the goal from early on in Kuomintang rule, but it wasn't achieved in the full sense until 1996, when Taiwan successfully held its first open and fair presidential election. There were two main parties, the newly legalized Democratic Progressive Party and the Kuomintang. In Taiwan, it's important for politicians to have a stance on independence. They can basically either be for 1, maintaining the status quo, which is typically seen as the safest option in terms of geopolitical strategy, or 2, they can be pro-independence, which means taking steps to get Taiwan recognized as a sovereign country, or 3, they can be pro-unification with China. In 1996, the DPP candidate was openly pro-independence, and the Kuomintang candidate also signaled support for independence by making statements like this one in 1994, which he made while he was president of Taiwan as a single-party state. Until now, those who held power in Taiwan were always from outside Taiwan, but now I can bluntly say the following. Even the Kuomintang was an outside force. It was the only party that could govern the Taiwanese. We must make the Kuomintang into a party for the Taiwanese people. The Kuomintang candidate won in 1996, and the DPP candidate won the next election 4 years later. With that, the Kuomintang rotated out of office, and the Democratic Progressive Party rotated in. The Taiwanese people had themselves chosen their first leaders in history and rotated the ruling party out of office, and both candidates were more or less pro-independence. With that democratization came, as one Taiwanese historian put it, an emerging sense of national self-determination. With that, there's been an emerging consensus in Taiwan that Taiwan is its own country, with its own culture, its own history, and now its own government. The amount of people who identify as Taiwanese has basically been on a linear increase since then. More than 60% of people in Taiwan exclusively identify as Taiwanese now. The rest identify as both Chinese and Taiwanese. Almost no one in current-day Taiwan exclusively identifies as Chinese. There's also been rising support for independence since then. The three main policy positions that the public holds are: 1, to maintain the status quo for now, where Taiwan is a semi-recognized state with a tenuous connection to China. The second position is to maintain the status quo indefinitely. And the third is to immediately move towards independence. In contemporary Taiwan, very few people want to officially unify with China. So when the People's Republic of China claims ownership of Taiwan and talks about moving forward unifying China and Taiwan, as another author put it, Taiwanese do not find this prospect at all attractive. They just got themselves out from under one single-party state and see no reason why they should jump into the arms of another. To the Taiwanese, the Chinese Communist Party has always been a foreign government. It's never been a governing authority in Taiwan. It's even historically been an aggressive foreign government. Since the Kuomintang relocated to Taiwan, Taiwan has pretty much been under constant threat from the CCP and mainland China. They fired artillery at the island of Quemoy for years. They regularly threatened Taiwanese airspace and staged military drills around the island. To Taiwanese, this comes across as intimidation. The show of force wouldn't be necessary if China actually had a legitimate claim to Taiwan. When the government of Taiwan does gesture that it wants to move closer to China, there's often a popular backlash, like with the Sunflower Movement in 2014, that protested a trade pact that was thought to give China economic power over Taiwan. There's more to Taiwanese politics than their relationship with China, but you can still roughly track support for independence by looking at the performance of the Democratic Progressive Party, which successfully made itself out to be the party that takes strong stances on Taiwanese independence. President Tsai Ing-wen rejects the term, but her victory in 2020 is typically referred to as a landslide win. This is Tsai speaking to the significance of that win.
A very strong message from the people of Taiwan. That is, they don't like the idea of being threatened all the time. They don't like the idea of being undermined all the time. And we're such proud people, and we have success in every aspect of our lives. Like we're a successful democracy. We have pretty decent economy. We deserve respect from China.
Moving over to China, there's a famous story of an interaction that occurred between National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger and Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. They were getting to know each other during the Cold War negotiations, and Kissinger asked Zhou what he thought the repercussions were of the French Revolution of 1789. Zhou thought for a moment and responded, "It is too early to tell." If you found that response suspiciously clever, then congratulations. It came from a misunderstanding. Zhou thought he was being asked about the student uprisings in Paris in 1968. But it's a popular story because there's at least some truth in its message, especially when it comes to Taiwan, and that's that China's leaders think in terms of surprisingly long timelines. To cover China's side of the story, that's a good starting point. The second thing to say is that China, or at least what we can intelligibly call China, is incredibly old. I think the simplest way to get that across is to look at Confucius. Confucius lived from 551 to 479 BC. So if you could wrap your head around that, that's around 2,500 years ago. But he claimed his ideas weren't original. Confucius lived in a time of political decay, and he framed himself as someone who was trying to recapture the better ideas of earlier generations, ideas from an earlier, better time in Chinese civilization. It's controversial how old China is. Its history stretches so far back that we basically run out of evidence for it and it becomes a myth. The point is that China is old. In the Chinese mind, China was the Middle Kingdom. It was the hub of civilization. The people who had the misfortune to live outside of China were mostly considered barbarians. China also had the wealth, power, and inventiveness to back that attitude up. China, through all its dynastic periods, never believed that it encountered another society that could be considered its equal. As Henry Kissinger put it, that the Chinese Empire should tower over its geographical sphere was taken virtually as a law of nature, an expression of the mandate of heaven. To show deference to China, foreign envoys were expected to kowtow to the emperor. They had to put their body in a position of extreme submission. Civilizations that could even conceivably be thought of as equal remained isolated from China, either by choice or by geography. India, for example, was mostly segregated from China by the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau. And China and Japan had a mutual agreement to break off contact for even centuries at a time as a way of resolving awkward questions of superiority between the two civilizations. So basically, the Chinese thought highly of themselves. When the Industrial Revolution occurred, China's isolation and ethnocentrism meant that they were slow to adapt to the rapidly changing world. As the world industrialized, China fell behind. As a result, China went through what's called the Century of Humiliation. They were dominated over and over by foreign countries, militarily and economically. Capitalizing on China's weakness, foreign powers carved away pieces of it, claiming them for their own. Imperial Japan was one of those powers, claiming the island of Formosa for themselves after crushing China in the First Sino-Japanese War. By the early 20th century, China had fallen so far from grace that it became known as the sick man of Asia, a country with a backwards culture, weak military, and a struggling economy. That period is described as leaving a sort of collective wound on the Chinese psyche. A culture that was once so proud had fallen so far behind. And with that, there's been a corresponding dream to recapture that former greatness, and thus definitively end this period of humiliation, to basically make China a superpower again. Here's how a prominent Chinese scholar put it. The rise of China is granted by nature. Even as recently as 1820, just 20 years before the Opium War, China accounted for 30% of the world's GDP. This history of superpower status makes the Chinese people very proud of their country on one hand, and on the other hand, very sad about China's current international status. They believe China's decline is a historical mistake, which they should correct. The next piece of this puzzle is the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP won the Civil War in 1949. Chiang's Kuomintang fled to Taiwan, and Mao made China into the People's Republic of China. From there, Mao wanted to rebuild China as a unified, strong nation. One part of that plan was to regain territories that had been taken from China when it was weak. Mao specifically wanted to re-extend China's borders to those furthest reached by the Qing dynasty in the height of their power. Russian influence meant that Mao had to give up on territories north of the Xinjiang border, which left China to mostly focus on regaining Tibet and Taiwan. Tibet was relatively easy to take, but Taiwan was considered a much more serious challenge. Military leadership called invading Taiwan an extremely big problem that would involve the biggest campaign in the history of modern Chinese warfare. Mao still planned to invade Taiwan in 1950, and even told communists in North Korea to delay their attack on the South to accommodate that. But then he reversed course and pledged his support for them, which began the Korean War. America joined the conflict to defend South Korea and sent a fleet to the Taiwan Strait. The fleet prevented China from invading Taiwan. China entered the war to save the collapsing North Korean army.
Full-scale Chinese intervention is about to bring the second phase of the Korean conflict to an end.
And American resolve to defend Taiwan from China galvanized, even though that support was inconsistent at first, and would historically go on to be more of a strong implication than a hard commitment. China, still a weak geopolitical power, lost its opportunity to reclaim Taiwan for the foreseeable future. That sequence of events, more or less, created the status quo that we're used to today. It's been about 70 years since then, but China's fundamental position on Taiwan hasn't changed. China sees Taiwan as a territory that's rightfully theirs, a territory that was taken from them in a moment of weakness. It's also seen as a matter of unresolved business, a remnant of a civil war that never ended. Since the Kuomintang fled to Taiwan, China's seen Taiwan as a province that's temporarily broken away from the mainland. That means the Taiwan issue to China is an internal Chinese issue. They believe the outside world has no business interfering with it. Although it should be said, that logic only works if China can prove that Taiwan is indeed part of China. China's answer to that can be found in an official white paper from 2022 on Taiwan. The argument goes that when the Chinese Communist Party made China into the People's Republic of China, they inherited the history of earlier Chinas, like the history of Ming and Qing governance on Taiwan. They also believe they inherited the sovereignty rights of the previous government, the Republic of China, and also the territory that the Republic of China held, which includes Taiwan. Now, with that all being said, I think China's official position on Taiwan can be put simply. It can be boiled down to two phrases. The first is that there is no Taiwan separate from China, which is also known as the One China principle. A good articulation of that principle comes from China's anti-secession law, passed in 2005, which reads, "There is only one China in the world. Both the mainland and Taiwan belong to one China. China's sovereignty and territorial integrity brook no division. Safeguarding China's sovereignty and territorial integrity is the common obligation of all Chinese people, the Taiwan compatriots included. Taiwan is part of China. The state shall never allow the Taiwan independence secessionist forces to make Taiwan secede from China under any name or by any means." The second phrase is a direct quote said in 1995 by China's vice premier, which reads, "We have no maneuver room on the Taiwan question. We will never give up our principled position on Taiwan." China frames the assimilation of Taiwan back into China as a matter of historical inevitability. They say it's something that will happen. There's no discussion about whether or not it'll happen, and there's no changing the basic premises of the argument. Phrased another way, again in the 2022 white paper, China said, "The wheel of history rolls on towards national reunification, and it will not be stopped by any individual or any force." So there's no room in this philosophy for people living in Taiwan to change China's mind. If people living in Taiwan don't want to assimilate into China, that's something that cannot change China's mind, at least according to their official position. Since China believes that its sovereignty extends over Taiwan, since they believe Taiwan is part of China, they believe they should be able to use whatever means they see fit to deal with Taiwan. They specifically don't want to omit war as an option.
我们不承诺放弃使用武力，保留采取一切必要措施的选项。
Which is presumably because omitting the use of force would imply a limitation on China's sovereignty over Taiwan. But historically speaking, they'd prefer if unification happened peacefully. Mao Zedong did believe that Taiwan had to be unified through war. But Deng Xiaoping in the 80s set a new tone by pushing for peaceful unification, and even offered terms to Taiwan. That more or less has become the official position since. Peaceful unification is the ideal, but war, if necessary, is on the table. So with the Taiwan conflict, we have two outlooks that can't be easily reconciled with each other. You have the Taiwanese, who see themselves as finally free from colonial rule, who are finally exercising national self-determination, and who are keen to continue down that path. And you have China, wanting to recover its former glory and strength, who sees Taiwan as a territory that rightfully belongs to it and cannot be separated from it, and who sees interference from any outside countries on Taiwan as a breach of its sovereignty and a throwback to a century of humiliation, which is why they say,
China's sovereignty cannot be infringed, and the Chinese people cannot be humiliated.
That's all I have for today. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.